Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2023, the summer of Trek, which is slowly coming to an end. This is the third year of Book Trek that was started by Vin at Revenant Reads, designed to read Star Trek. Star Trek nonfiction, Star Trek fiction, anything from the millions and millions of examples of Star Trek fiction throughout the whole course of the summer. And I've been reading Star Trek from the beginning, Star Trek fiction from the beginning, so it was a natural fit for me to just throw more Star Trek onto the reading every night, whether it's rereading something or reading new things. I've read a lot of new stuff for the years of Book Trek and really enjoyed it. But Book Trek is coming to an end because the summer is coming to an end. Labor Day is almost upon us. The end of the week is the end of the month. It's not going to feel that way for most of the country. It's certainly not even going to feel that way for New England, which has been blessed with cooler weather while the rest of the country has broiled. But next week, it's going to be warm here in New England. So here in Boston, anyway, it's going to be warm all week long, starting on Sunday, going for the whole length of the week, and then ending like clockwork on Friday. So it's not going to feel like the end of summer, but nevertheless, Book Trek only has a couple of days left. So I'm making the most of it, as I tend to do on BookTube events like this. I'm making the most of it. And I had originally planned last night to try and find something new to read. Some Star Trek that I haven't read before. There's millions of examples of Star Trek that I haven't read before, as much as I've read. There's still tons that I haven't read. But at the end, the roulette wheel spin brought me to something new, to something old, something very familiar, something from a long time ago. 1984, I think, is when this book came out. God almighty, I remember the year 1983. I remember thinking, so you're telling me that that next year is going to be the year 1984. So instead of just reading the book, that is actually going to be a year on the calendar. And I remember thinking, well, that's going to be really, really weird for the whole length of the year, but at least none of us has to worry about ever getting to 2001. But I went back all the way almost to the beginning of Star Trek fiction for this. Jean Laura's book, The Vulcan Academy Murders, with a Boris Vallejo cover, is that right? Or is that a Rowena cover? Fairly nice cover, an original Star Trek cover. They didn't do many of these before they stopped. This is number 20? Yeah, this is Star Trek novel number 20. So a couple of years of Star Trek fiction this occurred around then. It's an original episode. It's an episode. It's set in the original series. So Spock has his normal uniform on. Everybody is from the normal time period. And it's, as you can tell from the title, it's a Vulcan-heavy story. But it starts with the Klingons. It starts with the Enterprise in battle with the Klingons. And the Enterprise outguns the Klingon ship, but it's still a rough battle, and the Enterprise takes damage and loses some people. And one of the crew member that they don't lose, nevertheless, has a catastrophic accident. McCoy thinks he might have been caught in some sort of freakish energy discharge. He is stable. He doesn't need life support, but he's totally non-responsive. Eyes open, but nothing at all. Looks completely vegetated. And McCoy is wondering, well, I've taken him off life support. I saved him from the initial shock, then I took him off life support, but who knows if he doesn't live his whole life like this. It'd be nice to know if he's still there somewhere, and of course that raises the question of Mr. Spock's Vulcan mind meld. It shouldn't. It shouldn't raise that prospect. It's an intensely private thing for Spock. It shouldn't be just something that you trot out, much less use as a weapon, as in Star Trek The Undiscovered Country. Less said about that, the better. But nevertheless, Kirk and McCoy do turn to Spock to, could you mind meld with this young man and see if he's still in there at all? And Spock does, and he comes back to give them his report. And his report is awful. His report is that, yeah, he's in there. He's completely aware. He hasn't had any kind of cognitive diminishment. He just can't do anything. He can't connect with the outside world at all. And McCoy, that makes him furious. In the book, we're told that it brings tears to his eyes. Because he's distraught at the fact that this is always going to be this way. This young man is going to be tormented his whole life by being aware and totally unable to do anything about that. Kirk is frustrated and says, is there anything you can do for him? McCoy says, nerves don't regenerate. Same line that we get in Thomas Covenant. McCoy says, nerves don't regenerate. And there's no process that is known that's in experiments or trials or anything like that would help. And Spock tells him, well, you wouldn't necessarily know about secret experiments that are being done at the Vulcan Science Academy. But I do. And they are showing a great deal of promise in regenerating damaged nerves. McCoy and Kirk both want to know why Spock knows about this, and they worry for a second in the narrative. They worry that he might be hiding a health problem from them. But no, he says it's his mother, Amanda Grayson, is suffering from xenosis, I think it's called, a neurological degeneration thing that her husband Sarek, Ambassador Sarek, has brought her to this institute in order to give this experimental treatment a try. So the Enterprise, having whooped the tail of this Klingon vessel, turns out they aren't far from Vulcan, how that works, but they decide to go to Vulcan and bring this injured person in hopes of getting a treatment. Somebody else there is also getting treatment, and they hook this guy up in a stasis field and whatnot for this treatment. They meet the man who is largely responsible for generating this new science. He's a human who lives on Vulcan, and who is affianced to a Vulcan woman. So you get echoes of what it must have been like in Vulcan society for Sarek, extremely revered, an extremely respected figure, to marry an Earth woman. Jean Laura gives us a lot of that in the course of this book. I don't know how much of it is canon. Even in the Star Trek written universe, I don't know how much of it we're going by. But if you're a fan of that sort of thing, if you're a fan of original Star Trek, and especially the Vulcans and Vulcan society, you're going to love this book. Because her imaginings are internally consistent. Whether they strike you as being externally consistent is another thing. I myself think that Sarek is almost never in character himself in this book, especially at the end when he loses his cookies emotionally. I can't imagine that happening, and that's because it wouldn't happen. And also, Kirk is drastically out of character in this book, much like the last book that I read. Because they get to Vulcan, and there's an accident, and the patient who had already been being treated for this neurological damage dies. It looks like, for natural reasons, it looks like his stasis field just fails. But it strikes Kirk a little bit wonky. It strikes a few people as a little bit wonky. It doesn't seem completely right. And then the Starfleet officer's stasis field fails, and he dies as well. You gotta feel for that guy. Rather pathetic story that not only to be zapped, but then to be zapped again, and to know that it's coming. And once it happens twice, people start to think, well, there's a murderer loose in the Vulcan Science Academy. And that's another part of the book that I didn't like it when I first read it 40 years ago, and I didn't like it this time either, where we're told that Vulcan is such a logical and peaceful society that they have no idea, no conception of crime. So when murders are actually committed on Vulcan, they have to sort of enlist Kirk and McCoy and Spock to sort of help them solve the crime. Kirk in this book, it's not much is made. I think it's mentioned only once, but Kirk and McCoy would barely be able to breathe, and would be dealing with 140 degree Fahrenheit temperatures all day long and all night long. So I don't know what kind of a position that Kirk would be in to start gumshoeing, but nevertheless he does until he's distracted by a beautiful woman. Why, of course, Vulcan would have a crime-solving facility, and they would have police of some kind. And also, even if they didn't, your average Vulcan off the street would be better at doing this sort of thing than Kirk would. So that didn't make any sense. That also was drastically out of character. I don't know why Star Trek writers, whether it's here or for the show, always like to portray Vulcans as these helpless beings who can't defend themselves in any way. It crops up over and over and over again. In Reunification, the Star Trek The Next Generation episode that has Mr. Spock return in the Next Generation timeline. The whole plot of that episode, that two-part episode, is that the Romulans have captured vessels that are going to go incognito to Vulcan. 3 vessels that are going to conquer Vulcan for the Romulan Star Empire. And the unspoken idea in that story is that not only would the personnel of 3 starships be enough to conquer the planet Vulcan, but that Vulcan has no space defenses of its own. When that is nonsense. And I've read many fans and some authors throughout the years have said that what would have happened is that the Vulcan would not have needed the Federation. They would not have needed Jean-Luc Picard to come riding to the rescue. They would have just quietly logically dealt with these intruders. Same thing with in one of the first J.J. Abrams lens flare movies, where Vulcan is attacked by, Eric Bana yelling his lines, and they're absolutely defenseless. They have no way to fight the attack. Only Kirk's Enterprise can do that. And that is true in this book as well. The Vulcans are all just these high elven ingenues who can't do anything when there's a murder. Murder isn't logical. We follow a tortured conventional murder mystery plot in this book. It's obvious right from the beginning who the murderer is. I mean it. I know I've read a million murder mysteries and a ton of science fiction, lots of Star Trek, but leave all that aside. If I'd come to this originally just new and cold, you can pick the murderer out in a heartbeat, just in a heartbeat. If you don't know it with the first clue, you will know it with the second, and the second clue happens on like page 30. You've got the whole rest of the book just waiting for the reveal, and you're not wrong. When you get to the end and the reveal, you're not wrong. You also know what's going to happen, right? You're told all throughout this book that this nerve regeneration treatment is experimental and that it's in danger. Someone is endangering it. But you've also been told that if it doesn't work, Spock's mother is going to die, and you know that's not going to happen. So, so you know that as well. There are lots of elements in this thing where the suspense is taken away. There are a couple of Vulcan villains. They share the same kinds of problems that we've seen already, that we saw in Star Trek: The Lost Years. Vulcans with superpowers, evil Vulcans with superpowers, with magical superpowers. That is very lazy on the part of a writer. I don't recall this writer being lazy, but this, and not only that, but the drama of a whodunit is significantly lessened if a lot of the characters can mind meld with a lot of other characters, because you can't hide a murderer in a mind meld, I don't think. We get all kinds of Vulcan characters here. We get T'Pau as a major part to play in this book. Of course, Sarek is all over this book. We get some new Vulcan characters that are interesting. This is an interesting book. I don't remember being completely, bafflingly defeated by it the first time I read it. I think I read it also in the 90s, in the late 90s. I've come to it again. I don't know that I will read this again. I'm certainly glad that I have an ebook instead of a print book taking up space. Imagine it. An old print book that was never anything but average, taking up space on a shelf and getting reread maybe once every 20 years. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. So I'm glad that's not true. But there wasn't even the nostalgia factor. I mean, nostalgia with me applies to earlier Star Trek novels than this. By the time this book came out, old Star Trek fans who've been thirsty for Star Trek work, new Star Trek books, by the time this book came out, we knew we were going to get them. We knew we were going to get a steady supply. We didn't know how many were coming, but we knew it was going to be a steady supply. So that element of nostalgia for a reread is gone. And there wasn't much to replace it. This was... So I don't know what I'm going to do for tonight's Book Trek read. This has sort of put me off the idea of going back to something that I already know. So I may not do that. I may go to something new. Although there I run the risk of a genuine disappointment. This wasn't disappointing. It was just sort of sat there. We shall see. It's all one big melodrama. So I'll wrap this up for now, and we'll see what I come up with tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.